In today's video, we'll explore 5 deadly encounters between zookeepers and apex predators. From a jaguar's brutal feeding frenzy in Phoenix to a grizzly bear's savage mauling in Calgary. But first we begin in Texas, where a veteran keeper's experience would prove no match for pure predatory power. It was April 12th, 2016, in Dallas, Texas. The morning was cool and overcast, the zoo grounds still quiet before the flow of visitors. The routine of animal care unfolded as it had countless times before, with keepers moving between enclosures in practiced rhythm. But within the lion habitat, a small lapse in procedure would turn a familiar task into tragedy. Eva Goggins was 62, a senior zookeeper who had spent over 3 decades at the Dallas Zoo. She was widely respected among colleagues for her steady presence, a woman who rarely lost her composure even under pressure. Eva had begun working at the zoo in her 20s, rising to a trusted position where she trained younger keepers. Her reputation was built not on innovation, but on dependability. Staff leaned on her for guidance, and she carried a quiet pride in knowing the animals well, especially the big cats. Though careful by nature, Eva had grown accustomed to routines that dulled the edge of caution. Years of experience gave her confidence that she could judge the moods and patterns of the lions she cared for. However, she sometimes skipped formal steps to save time, convinced that her familiarity and instincts were enough. Her goal that morning was simple: clear debris and inspect part of the enclosure before visitors arrived. She believed the lions were secure behind barriers, as they usually were during cleaning. That belief, though, rested more on habit than on confirmation. The lion exhibit stretched with sandy soil, scattered rocks, and a broad viewing area beyond the reinforced glass for the public. Artificial trees and shaded outcroppings gave cover to the cats. In the early morning light, the stillness concealed the latent power of predators built for ambush. African lions, especially adult males, can weigh over 400 pounds, with a bite force exceeding 600 pounds per square inch. They are ambush hunters by design, often staying motionless in cover before launching sudden attacks. Though born in captivity, zoo lions retain the same predatory instincts. Keepers are trained never to enter enclosures with them unsecured, as even a moment of direct contact can prove fatal. Warnings were present. Eva's 2 younger co-workers later admitted they had seen the male lion lingering near the rear rock outcropping, restless before Eva entered. They assumed she knew where the animal was positioned. Protocol called for the lions to be locked into a separate holding area before any keeper stepped inside. But Eva bypassed the step, considering the inspection too brief to require it. Her colleagues hesitated to correct her, deferring to her seniority. The oversight would prove irreversible. Eva moved slowly along the ground, collecting fallen branches and checking the fence line. Her focus was on the debris, not on scanning for the animal. Behind her, the lion shifted, emerging silently from the rocks. Her co-workers, watching from outside the locked gate, noticed too late. By the time they shouted, the lion had already lunged. The impact was immediate and violent. The lion slammed Eva against the wall of the enclosure, knocking the breath from her. Before she could recover, the animal's jaws clamped down across her neck and shoulder, driving her to the ground. Witnesses outside saw her body convulse as the lion maintained the crushing hold, its weight pressing her into the sand. Eva's arms flailed briefly as she tried to push against the lion's chest. The claws raked across her torso, tearing through her uniform, leaving deep parallel gashes that bled heavily onto the sand. Her co-workers banged on the bars with tools, their voices breaking as they screamed for help. The lion dragged Eva several feet. Her legs kicked weakly before slowing, movement fading under the suffocating pressure at her throat. The staff emergency response was rapid but insufficient against the animal's speed. A tranquilizer dart was fired from outside, striking the lion's flank, but the drug would take minutes to act. Someone phoned for an ambulance, but Ava had already sustained catastrophic blood loss. The lion finally released her, circling briefly before retreating back toward the rocks. The scene left her colleagues in shock. Staff members rushed in once the lion weakened from the tranquilizer, but Ava showed no signs of life. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and the body was removed quietly, shielded from early visitors who had not yet reached the area. Investigators later documented deep puncture wounds consistent with the lion's canines, along with claw marks across her torso. The coroner's report later confirmed Eva died from massive hemorrhage and airway crushing caused by the lion's bite to the neck. The funeral was subdued, attended by family, colleagues, and a small group of zoo staff who had worked alongside her for years. Media coverage was limited to local outlets, presenting the event as a tragic workplace accident rather than a spectacle. At the zoo, the lion exhibit was closed for weeks. The animals moved off public display. New policies reinforced the prohibition on solo entry into carnivore enclosures, rules that Eva herself had once emphasized to younger keepers. Eva's decades of experience proved no match for the lion's crushing jaws, and just 2 years earlier in Arizona, a jaguar specialist would make one fatal mistake with a 220-pound spotted fury. It was September 7, 2014, in Phoenix, Arizona. The morning heat had already settled in, carrying the dry weight of late summer across the desert city. Families filtered into the Phoenix Zoo, moving from shaded paths to observation areas, expecting routine displays of animals going about their day. Few could have imagined that within one of those exhibits, a lapse in procedure would end with tragedy witnessed in real time. Laura Mitchell was 29, a zookeeper who had worked at the Phoenix Zoo for 6 years. She had gravitated to exotic cats early in her career, drawn to their power and independence. Colleagues regarded her as competent and committed, someone who cared deeply about enrichment and feeding routines. Mitchell was deliberate in her work, but not without small risks, habits born of repetition. Her confidence with the jaguar, in particular, sometimes led her to treat tasks around the enclosure with less caution than the formal guidelines demanded. Her life outside the zoo was quiet. She lived in a modest apartment near Tempe, drove an aging sedan, and rarely missed her early morning shifts. Mitchell saw her work as more than a job. It was a responsibility to maintain the health and behavior of animals most people would only glimpse behind glass. On that September morning, her goal was simple: adjust a feeding platform and prepare meat for the jaguar's mid-morning feed. It was the sort of routine she had carried out dozens of times, familiar enough to feel safe. The jaguar exhibit was designed with sandy ground, climbing logs, and a shaded pool where the animal sometimes rested. To visitors, it resembled a fragment of jungle transplanted into the desert, though the heat was sharper and drier than the species' natural environment. That morning, children pressed their hands against the viewing glass, waiting for the animal to appear. Jaguars are the largest cats in the Americas, averaging 200 to 250 pounds, with males capable of exceeding that. They possess one of the strongest bite forces of any big cat, powerful enough to pierce turtle shells and crush bone. In captivity, keepers are trained to use secure shifts and barriers during feeding, as direct proximity to the animal is never considered safe. Even well fed, their instinct to ambush and overpower remains intact. Warnings were present. Mitchell's co-workers had occasionally reminded her not to leave gates half-latched, a small shortcut she used when moving between spaces. On this day, visitors later reported seeing the jaguar pacing more than usual, tail flicking as it moved near the barrier. The heat may have heightened its agitation. Despite these cues, Mitchell entered the secondary holding pen without fully engaging the gate lock, believing she could quickly adjust the feeding platform before opening the chute for meat. Her focus was on efficiency, not the potential hazard just behind the barrier. From the observation area, families watched as she bent near the platform. The half-latched gate shifted slightly, leaving a narrow gap. Within seconds, the jaguar lunged forward, exploiting the opening. The impact was sudden. 220 pounds of muscle and claws slamming into Mitchell, knocking her flat against the hard surface of the pen floor. Screams rose from the crowd as the cat clamped its jaws onto her thigh, dragging her backward. Mitchell's voice carried across the enclosure, sharp cries breaking as the animal shook her leg violently. The jaguar reared back and bit into her abdomen, teeth sinking into soft tissue. Witnesses described her body arching under the pressure, her arms pushing weakly at the animal's head. The sound of tearing fabric mixed with the guttural growls reverberating inside the pen. Staff rushed from nearby enclosures. One keeper sprayed a fire extinguisher through the barrier, the hiss of gas clouding the air. The jaguar resisted, dragging Mitchell several feet. Her movements slowed as the animal's claws raked her midsection, opening deep gashes. The crowd outside wailed, parents pulling their children back from the glass, some covering their faces. A high-pressure hose was brought in, water blasting against the cat's body. The force startled it enough to release her, retreating briefly toward the corner. Mitchell lay motionless. Keepers rushed in to drag her clear of the enclosure, lifting her onto a stretcher, while one of them called 911. By the time paramedics arrived, she showed no signs of responsiveness. The wounds to her abdomen and thigh had caused massive blood loss. Despite emergency attempts, she was pronounced dead on sight. The autopsy later documented multiple deep lacerations, a severed femoral artery, and extensive abdominal trauma consistent with a large animal attack. Cause of death was listed as exsanguination due to jaguar-inflicted injuries. Her funeral was private, attended mostly by family and co-workers. Among zoo staff, the loss was described as preventable, a result of small shortcuts that became habit over time. The Phoenix Zoo was fined for safety lapses, and reinforced standards were put in place requiring double checks on barriers for all big cat enclosures. The jaguar exhibit reopened weeks later, unchanged in appearance. But even as Laura Mitchell's screams echoed through the Phoenix Zoo, just months later in the Netherlands, a keeper would discover that 15 years of trust meant nothing when a silverback is released. It was April 19, 2015, in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. The spring air was mild, carrying a faint chill beneath the overcast sky. Families filled the paths of Diergaarde Blijdorp, the Rotterdam Zoo, wandering between aviaries and primate houses. And inside one enclosure, a mechanical failure and a single miscalculation would turn a usual routine into a violent incident. Martin de Vries was 42 and a senior keeper who had worked with the zoo's gorillas for more than 15 years. Known among colleagues as steady and disciplined, he had built a reputation for his calmness in handling unpredictable animals. De Vries had a methodical nature, priding himself on routine and consistency. He was not reckless, but was deeply accustomed to the rhythms of the troop, especially the dominant male, a silverback named Bakari. His long career made him a point of reference for younger staff, who often relied on him to model safe practices. His life revolved around the zoo. Unmarried, with a small apartment not far from the city center, he was the type to spend extra hours in the primate house, even after shifts ended. Co-workers said he seemed most at ease among the gorillas. That Sunday, his role was to conduct a cleaning inside the habitat, removing debris before the animals were cycled back in. For him, the task was routine. The assumption was simple. Bakari had been shifted into a secure holding pen, leaving the main enclosure empty. The decision to step inside alone was consistent with years of experience and trust in established systems. The gorilla enclosure at Rotterdam Zoo was built with rockwork, climbing structures, and grassy slopes framed by high viewing windows where visitors gathered. Beneath its naturalistic design lay reinforced concrete, steel gates, and locking mechanisms meant to guarantee separation between humans and animals. Gorillas, though primarily herbivores, are powerful primates capable of sudden, overwhelming violence. Adult silverbacks can exceed 400 pounds, with arms nearly twice as strong as the average humans. Their bite force rivals that of large predators, and their chest-beating displays are not empty shows, but signals of dominance that can precede forceful attacks. In captivity, keepers are trained never to share direct space with them. The barrier systems, if properly engaged, are the safeguard. That morning, however, the safeguard failed. De Vries entered after signaling to a co-worker that Bakari had been locked into the holding pen. Unknown to him, a latch had malfunctioned, allowing the silverback to push back into the main enclosure. Visitors later recalled seeing the gorilla pacing along the rock wall, its broad shoulders moving with tension. De Vries, focused on clearing debris near the viewing glass, gave no sign of noticing. From the gallery, families with children watched, pointing out the keeper inside. Seconds later, Bakari emerged from behind a rock outcropping. The charge was immediate, a blur of dark muscle across the enclosure. Witnesses said the impact sounded like a heavy object slamming against wood. The gorilla struck De Vries square in the chest, both arms driving him backward into the concrete barrier. He crumpled to the ground, gasping as the air left his lungs. Bakari did not pause. He seized the keeper by the arm, lifting him as though weightless, and hurled him several feet across the floor. The sound of bone and flesh meeting concrete echoed in the enclosed space. De Vries attempted to crawl, but the gorilla was on him again. With both fists, Bakari pounded his back. Screams erupted from the gallery as parents pulled children away from the glass. De Vries's legs kicked weakly as Bakari gripped him and slammed him side to side, the motion more like violent tossing than dragging. His body snapped against the ground, limp in moments, though faint movement was still visible. The gorilla struck his head against the floor, leaving a dark pool spreading beneath him. Staff arrived within a minute, deploying fire hoses through the barriers. Jets of water lashed at the gorilla, but Bakari only tightened his grip, slamming De Vries's torso against the ground before pounding his chest and abdomen with both fists. The blows left deep indentations and visible tearing along his uniform. Witnesses said his body no longer resisted after that sequence. Tranquilizer teams fired darts, the first striking Bakari's shoulder, the second his flank. The gorilla continued its assault for nearly a minute, slamming the limp body against the floor before retreating under the growing effect of the sedative. Only then did keepers move in, pulling De Vries clear. His body showed massive trauma, multiple fractures, chest collapse, and severe head injuries. Emergency crews called by the staff arrived within minutes, but only confirmed his death. The report listed blunt force trauma to the chest and head as the cause, injuries consistent with the repeated strikes. The funeral was held in Rotterdam days later, attended by colleagues who had worked with him for decades. They remembered his patience and the care he had shown for the troop, even as they admitted the risks had always been present. The zoo issued a short statement, noting the incident as a workplace accident, and quietly reinforced the barrier systems in the primate house. The gorilla exhibit was closed for weeks, reopening only after modifications to the latch systems. However, even as Martin's body was pounded against the concrete in Rotterdam, 5 years later, in the Canadian wilderness of Calgary Zoo, a zookeeper would step into an empty enclosure, unaware that 600 pounds of grizzly fury was about to burst through. It was August 25th, 2018, in Calgary, Alberta. The late summer sun lit the zoo grounds, families walking slowly between shaded exhibits as the day warmed. The grizzly bear enclosure, one of the Calgary Zoo's most popular attractions, was scheduled for a quiet enrichment session before opening fully to the public, but would not open that day due to something horrific. Derek Wallace was 36, a keeper who had been at the zoo for nearly a decade. His specialty was large mammals, bears, bison, and other species that required both strength and calmness from handlers. Colleagues described him as disciplined and dependable, someone who prided himself on doing the difficult work safely. He rarely cut corners, but he carried a confidence that sometimes translated into moving a step too quickly, assuming procedures would hold as they always had. Visitors often saw him giving talks near the bear exhibit, explaining their biology with steady, matter-of-fact delivery. Outside of work, Wallace lived a quiet life. He kept a modest apartment, spent time running trails near the Bow River, and was known among friends as someone who avoided risks outside of his job. His dedication to the animals was his main drive. That morning, his goal was straightforward: prepare the outdoor yard with enrichment objects, logs, toys, and food scents, so the bears could be released later to stimulate natural foraging behavior. The task was routine, one he had performed countless times. His decision to step inside, believing both bears were secured, was not reckless in his eyes, only another repetition of standard work. The grizzly enclosure sat on the eastern side of the zoo, a broad yard of dirt, grass, and scattered boulders, with a stream flowing through the middle. The air carried the faint smell of hay and damp soil. From the public gallery above, families could look down into the enclosure, where the two adult grizzlies, a male weighing over 600 pounds and a slightly smaller female, were housed. Grizzly bears are among the largest predators in North America, with adult males standing over 7 feet on their hind legs and equipped with claws 4 inches long. Their bite force can exceed 1,200 pounds per square inch, capable of crushing bone. Though captive-born, their behavior remains rooted in instinct. Food, territory, and dominance determine their reactions. Keepers are trained to avoid direct contact entirely, relying on secured gates and shift procedures to move animals safely. Earlier that week, one gate between the indoor holding and the outer yard had been sticking slightly, requiring extra effort to latch fully. Staff noted it, planning to repair it during routine maintenance. On that morning, another keeper stood nearby, observing as Wallace entered, but from her angle she could not clearly see if the latch had engaged. Wallace, trusting the system, carried the enrichment objects inside without pause. At first, everything was calm. He walked across the dirt yard, setting down a toy against a boulder and scattering scents to encourage foraging. Families had already begun to gather at the gallery, watching with mild interest, though the bears themselves were expected to be inside. Then movement came from the rear gate. A heavy shape surged forward, fur brushing the metal as the male grizzly burst into the yard. The gate, not fully secured, had swung open under the animal's weight. The bear struck Wallace from behind with both forepaws. The impact drove him face first into the dirt, knocking the wind from his lungs. The sound of the hit was described by one witness as like a body slamming into wet sand. Wallace barely had time to move before the animal clamped down on his shoulder, claws tearing into his back. He cried out, muffled by the ground, as the grizzly raked its claws down his arms and sides. Dirt and blood mixed beneath him. The animal flipped him over with startling ease, jaws locking onto his torso. Visitors on the gallery screamed, some pulling children away, others frozen in place as the bear shook him violently. Keepers rushed to distract the animal, throwing food and banging metal, while others deployed high-pressure hoses through the barriers. The grizzly remained locked on. Wallace's body jerked with each bite, his legs twitching briefly before going still. The bear pressed its weight down, claws sinking into his abdomen. The struggle lasted under 2 minutes, though to those watching it stretched unbearably long. Staff finally managed to draw the bear back toward the holding area with food, slamming the gate shut once it crossed. They immediately called for paramedics. Wallace lay motionless, his uniform shredded, arms bent unnaturally. Medics entered within moments, but the damage was irreparable. He had suffered catastrophic trauma, deep lacerations across his torso, broken ribs, and severe blood loss. He was pronounced dead at the scene. His funeral days later was quiet, attended by family, co-workers, and a handful of longtime zoo visitors who knew him by name. There was no media spectacle, only a recognition among colleagues that familiarity with dangerous animals can create blind spots. Canadian authorities required the zoo to suspend bear demonstrations and revise handling procedures. The pair of grizzlies were kept out of public view for months, their yard reinforced and gate systems inspected thoroughly. But even as this handler's misstep became an example of deadly consequences, far away in India, another zookeeper handler would turn his back during a demonstration, never sensing the agitated predator preparing to pounce. It was November 2nd, 2013, in Kolkata, India. The morning was warm and damp, the kind of late autumn day when the air still carried the weight of summer. Families filled the Alipore zoological gardens, children tugging at their parents' hands toward the tiger enclosures. On the schedule was a public feeding demonstration, a routine event meant to show the animal's strength from a controlled distance. What unfolded instead left a permanent scar on both staff and visitors. Rakesh Banerjee was 41, a veteran keeper with more than a decade of experience at the zoo. He was known for his steady manner and his ability to keep demonstrations calm before large crowds. Over the years, he had developed a reputation for smooth presentations, rarely rattled by restless animals or noisy visitors. Colleagues described him as dependable, someone who took pride in showing the zoo as a safe place for families. But his long familiarity sometimes led him to cut small corners, trusting his instincts more than strict adherence to protocol. Banerjee's daily habits were precise. He arrived before sunrise, checked the big cat enclosures, and prepared the food with care. He had no interest in media attention, though demonstrations placed him in public view. For him, the work was about showing visitors that the animals were not monsters, but powerful creatures to be respected. On this particular day, his motivation was the same as always. Conduct the demonstration smoothly, keep the crowd engaged, and finish his rounds before the afternoon heat set in. Entering the enclosure briefly to adjust the feeding platform was not standard procedure, but it was something he had done before when he judged it safe. The tiger enclosure was a wide, grassy pit bordered by tall rock walls, with shaded areas where the animals could retreat from the sun. From the public gallery above, visitors could look down through reinforced barriers at the striped cats below. Bengal tigers are among the largest cats in the world, males weighing up to 500 pounds and equipped with claws that can pierce flesh in a single swipe. Their bite force, exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, allows them to crush bone as easily as muscle. Though captive-born, zoo tigers retain the instincts of ambush predators. Keepers are trained never to turn their backs and never to enter enclosures without animals securely locked away. That morning, warning signs were visible. One of the tigers, a large male, paced restlessly along the edge of the rock wall, its tail lashing in short, sharp movements. Some staff noted the agitation and suggested waiting until the animal calmed. Visitors near the front observed the tiger's repeated circling, whispering uneasily to each other. Banerjee appeared unconcerned. He stepped into the secondary space to adjust a feeding tray, confident the demonstration would continue without issue. Witnesses later recalled how quickly the sequence unraveled. Banerjee had turned his back, bending to collect meat from a bucket when the tiger lunged. The cat cleared the short distance in an instant, claws raking across his back as it pulled him down. Witnesses reported hearing a heavy thud and Banerjee's cry as the tiger struck, though most later admitted the details blurred in panic. The tiger clamped its jaws into his neck and chest, shaking him with violent force. Banerjee struggled briefly, his arms pushing weakly against the massive head before going slack. The animal dragged him several feet, paws leaving deep impressions in the soil before pinning him under its weight. Keepers rushed with poles and tools, slamming them against the barriers to distract the animal. The tiger responded with another shake, its teeth sinking deeper, muscle and bone tearing audibly. His body jerked with the motion, then lay motionless. Staff deployed fire extinguishers, white spray filling the air, but the animal did not release until another keeper blasted it with a high-pressure hose. Even then, the tiger backed away slowly, its muzzle soaked dark red, its eyes locked on the still figure on the ground. The entire attack lasted less than a minute. Visitors who had remained described it as feeling far longer, the sequence unfolding in brutal clarity. Banerjee's uniform was shredded. His chest and neck bore crushing injuries consistent with the tiger's bite, leaving him unresponsive within seconds. His face was turned toward the gallery, but there was no sign of recognition in his expression. When the enclosure was secured, medics called by staff entered immediately. They found no pulse. Blood loss had been massive, compounded by catastrophic crushing injuries to the chest and neck. The funeral was held in Kolkata days later, attended by family, colleagues, and a small group of long-time zoo visitors who had known Banerjee from years of demonstrations. The zoo suspended all public feeding demonstrations permanently. The tigers were moved to reinforced enclosures, their access restricted during any keeper presence. Authorities classified the case as a workplace accident and ordered an internal review, but no criminal charges were filed. Thanks for watching. If these stories of routine turned tragedy piqued your interest, click here for more.